Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to the 4th episode of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sara Orfali, and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. The path I want to travel onto today is a peculiar one. The past two characters, whether legendary or not, have been heroes specifically linked to the foundation and the history of a country. Their story might have already been partially reflected somewhere else, like for example with William Tell, but their names can be considered cornerstones of the modern countries of Switzerland and Italy. The character of this episode, though, is more linked to an institution than a country. The story has a specific geographical foundation in France, but the effects reverberated in most of Central Europe and the United Kingdom. The protagonist of this episode has been considered the founding mother of many a monarchy in Europe in the Middle Ages, with big royal names sprinting to add to their family tree. Though most countries in Europe today are republics, monarchy was the prevalent, if not directly the only institution on the continent in the past, with the exception of Switzerland, which, we did see, started out as a part of an empire and then developed as a democracy quite early. The landscape in Europe was divided into imperial lands, royal lands, but also duchies, counties and various peerages. Emperors and kings ruled by divine right, and as a way to extend their rule over vast territories, they divided their lands in smaller allotments, then assigned to noble families. These lords and ladies were responsible for the management and defense of the land they were given, although, with the exception of some very enlightened ruler, they mostly ended up emptying their coffers one way or another. Nowadays, most of these empires and monarchies are long gone. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe still retained 20 between kings and emperors, some of them with kingdoms and empires coming from an ancient past, like the Kingdom of Portugal, for example, founded in 1139, or the Ottoman Empire, dating back to the 3rd century AD. Both world wars and the uprising of the people in the 20th century meant the end for 8 of them, including the 4 great empires of Russia, Austria and Hungary, Germany, and the Ottomans. Today, only 12 remain, of which 7 are kingdoms. I think you're all familiar with the United Kingdom royal family, for example, or the Spanish one. 3 are principalities. Think Monaco, for example. 1 is the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. And the last one is the theocratic elective monarchy ruled by the Pope in Vatican City. With the exception of the Pope, who is always chosen from an assembly of cardinals, thus excluding any kind of birthrights, more or less half of the European monarchs ruling at the beginning of the 20th century came from one single royal stock. Queen Victoria of England, with 9 children and 42 grandchildren, has been rightly considered the grandmother of Europe. Her descendants have sat on thrones from the freezing Russia to the sunny Spain. As much as she can be considered the first living woman to have achieved such a feat, more incredible due to the fact that it was widely known she didn't like children, there is one other who, centuries before Victoria, can claim the role of ancestress in many a royal line. It is time I introduce to you the legendary heroine of today. Travelling through the forests of France, we happen upon a fountain, where we find, resting in the sun, the fay Melusine. you must never come look for me on a Saturday, or everything will be lost to you forever." These were the words spoken by Melusine as she accepted the courtship of Raymondin, Count of Poitou. This kind of story, where one of the main characters accepts a proposal only if specific conditions are met, is as old as it is familiar to us. We know that if the promise is upheld, then love and fortune will abound, but if the vow is broken, then all is lost, with or without redemption, depending on the tale. In the Western world, we grew up enmeshed in this trope. It is, after all, very widely used in our stories in different capacities. In some stories, like Cinderella, is one of the helpers, the fairy godmother, laying down conditions for the protagonist. While in other stories, like Sleeping Beauty or Snow White, it's the antagonist whose conditions, if not respected, will cause harm to the protagonist. In both cases, as long as the promise is upheld, then all is well. But the moment in which the protagonist goes against the request and breaks the conditions, then all the previously peaceful life is lost. Where do these stories come from, though? Is there one ancient story which can be considered a sort of ancestor? Yes, there is at least one. To get to it, allow me to skip the Middle Ages for the moment and go directly to ancient Greece. In the 2nd century AD, the writer Apuleius wrote the Metamorphoses, or better known to us as the Golden Ass, and in this work he wrote down his own version of the story of Eros and Psyche. I say his version because we know that the two characters of Eros and Psyche appear in Greek art as early as the 4th century BC. In this version of the story, Psyche incurs in Aphrodite's wrath, and the goddess sends her son Eros to hit her with an arrow so that she may fall in love with something hideous. Upon seeing her, though, it is Eros who falls in love and secretly marries her upon the condition that she never sees his face. When Psyche, badly counseled by her jealous sisters, lights a lamp in the night and sees Eros' face, the god of love vanishes from her sight, taking away the life and the riches he had granted her upon marriage. In the end, Psyche, through a series of trials, proves to Eros she is repentant, and they are finally married for all the gods to see, and she is granted immortality as the goddess of the human soul. All's well that ends well. How does this story relate to the myth of Melusine, though? I did say I was going to skip the Middle Ages for just a moment, but now it's finally time to delve into them, because it's in those centuries in which we see the evolution of the story, from an ancient myth to the modern fairy tale. The Middle Ages act also as the temporal background for the story of Melusine, and we'll see now how such story relates to the myth of Eros and Psyche and how it reverses it, contributing to the creation of our modern fairy tales. Before we delve into the story itself, there is one last bit I have to tell you to present the story. Unlike Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was a real person like you or me, or William Tell, thought to be real until proven otherwise, but still very much existing in the hearts of some people, well, Melusine never existed. She's always been a story, a legend, created to pass along a specific message. The story I'm about to tell you bears some resemblance with other stories before, but we owe this version, the one that became famous afterwards, to the imagination and the pen of Jean d'Arras, a French author who in 1393 published his Histoire de Lusignan, better known as the Romance of Melusine. While he did come up with a story on his own, so we assume, he had been commissioned to write it. But who commissioned him and why? The man who asked for such a story to be written was Jean de France, Duc de Berry. He was the third son of King John II the Good of France. Since the Duchy of Berry was a title originally created in France as an appanage for the junior members of the royal family, it was given to Jean, in line for the throne, but not close enough to really be in danger of inheriting it. That was, of course, until his brother Charles V of France died, leaving a child, Charles VI, too young to reign. Jean de Berry was then nominated as one of the regents of little Charles. He would reign in his nephew's stead on and off for almost 20 years, since Charles VI was unfortunately affected with insanity. At some point, the rightful king, in a bout of lucidity, managed to pass on the throne to his brother, who was not insane, thus eliminating the need of a regency. During this time as a regent, the 100 Years' War was racing on mainland Europe in the late Middle Ages. It mainly consisted in a series of armed conflicts between the kingdoms of England and France for the French throne, which the English claimed. In the middle of this conflict, Jean, Duc de Berry, controlled at least 1/3 of the territory in France, making him the most powerful man in the country. Such power deserved a good ancestry. That was why he commissioned Jean d'Arras to write for him a supernatural tale. He wanted a story which showcased the power and prestige of his family and, of course, himself. Such stories were not uncommon. Think, for example, at the illustrious example made by Virgil in writing the Aeneid, which connected Rome to Troy and the divine lineage coming from the goddess Aphrodite. In a Christian world, being direct descendants of pagan gods wasn't a particularly appreciated trait anymore, but having a fairy folk as an ancestor could explain a lot in terms of lack of the family, and would be a good excuse for any kind of physical or psychological malformation. To be honest, the Middle Ages saw as physical malformation things that would be quite overlooked today, like, for example, moles. So there was a lot of those going around. As for the psychological problems, while we know today that some of those were really psychiatric problems, most of them could have been reversed had they had access to what we know today. Behind Jean Duc de Berry's request, there's also the political aspect. As one of the best commanders in the 100 Years' War, he was also the one who conquered back a lot of territory from the English. To keep the other French nobles from trying to take his new lands away from him, he needed a way to prove that those lands had always belonged to his family. And if a record wasn't available, he had enough money and clout to commission his own. We will see how this story does what it was commissioned to do later in the episode, but first, let's dive down into the world of Melusine. The story of Melusine starts, like many other stories, not with her, but with her parents. In the age of the Crusades, King Linus of Albany, an ancient way of referring to the modern country of Scotland, was hunting with his knights in the forest when he happened across a river, and on the banks of that river sat the most beautiful woman he had ever encountered. Skin so fair it almost glistened like snow in the sun, hair as black as the darkest night, and a voice as melodious as a nightingale, as she sang a hauntingly beautiful song. Even at a glance, it was clear she wasn't human. She was a fae, a magical creature with human appearance, magical powers, and a penchant for trickery. She was so beautiful, though, that King Linus fell head over heels in love with her at first sight, ignoring all the signals pointing towards a non-human status. So lost was Linus in his love days that he barely asked for her name, which turned out to be Melusine, before blurting out what I think has to be the most unromantic proposal ever. "Marry me," he told her, "and I'll give you the finest clothes and riches in my kingdom." A good deal, to be sure, but evidently not enough to sway Melusine, who declined. So besotted was King Linus and so determined to have her as his wife that he asked again, swapping the finest clothes with the best lands in his kingdom, and, of course, his hand and the throne. Still, it wasn't enough, and Melusine declined again. I think, at this point, that the king was getting a little bit desperate, because he asked for a third time, offering the finest clothes, the best lands, and all the riches in his kingdom, if only Melusine would agree to marry him. I can imagine she must have looked like a cat which had swallowed a very rich canary. This time she smiled down at the king still kneeled in front of her. Imagine a king kneeling in front of someone else, and said, "Yes, but..." Honestly, at this point, I don't think Linus even heard the but. He was so overjoyed she had accepted that, after having basically given away his kingdom for a pair of pretty eyes, he would have agreed to anything at all. He might have wanted to listen with a little more attention to what Melusine was about to tell him, because his happiness and good luck in the future would all depend on what he was about to promise. "Yes," said the fairy Melusine, "I will become your wife, but you have to promise never to look upon me and my children on my childbed." Considering that she had just practically robbed him blind until that moment, asking for some privacy after having given birth didn't seem like a difficult request. After all, it was something that Linus, as a man, would have given her regardless. Like all good Christians in the Middle Ages, he believed that women were impure after birth, and they needed to be churched and cleansed before entering society once again. "I promise," he solemnly told her, probably secretly glad that she had asked for such a little thing and not the head of a dragon on a silver platter. With that, they were married, and what followed were some peaceful and prosperous years for the Kingdom of Albany. Fairies have always been considered harbingers of good fortune, and when happy, they would bring prosperity to people and lands. Such happiness for Linus and Melusine grew when the Queen announced she was pregnant. Having had only one son from his previous wife, who had died too soon, Linus was overjoyed at the news, and so was Melusine. In their years together, she had seen that he was a good man, pious, capable, and true to his word. Unfortunately for her, she was about to be very disappointed. The day of the birth, she retired to her chambers when she gave birth to triplets. 3 healthy and beautiful baby girls she called Melusine, Melior, and Palatine. She was adoringly gazing at their faces when the unthinkable happened. The door swung open with enough force to embed itself in the wall, and on the threshold stood Linus. The king had been so happy to welcome his new children into the world that he had completely forgotten about his promise to his wife. "You must never see me on my childbed." That was what Melusine had asked of him, and what Helinus had agreed to. And yet, there he was, an oath-breaker, even if just because he had wanted to see his children. Knowing that no excuse could undo what Helinus had done, Melusine's heart broke. She took her 3 daughters and vanished, taking with her Helinus' happiness and the prosperity of the kingdom. It is a common trope in these stories that, when offended, the fairy folk would take the bestowed good fortune away with them. Melusine moved to Avalon, yes, the one better known from the Arthurian legend, and there she remained, watching as her daughters grew up strong and beautiful, and telling them all the stories about their father and the kingdom which would never be theirs. As they turned older, the girls understood that they were living as prisoners for a sin they hadn't committed, and started to resent their father, Melusine most of all. As the eldest and the usual ringleader, she stirred up her younger sisters and convinced them that it was time their father was punished. For his sin, they buried him deep into a mountain from where he would never be able to get out again. Feeling very accomplished, Melusine and their sisters went back to their mother, pride dripping from every word as they told her exactly what they'd done. But rather than feeling proud and grateful like the 3 sisters had thought she would be, Melusine was furious. She had loved Helinus deeply, and she still loved him from the bottom of her heart. And now, thanks to what her daughters had done, he was forever lost to her. Her punishments were merciless. The younger daughter, Palatine, was trapped in a mountain. Some versions say it's the same mountain as her father, surrounded by her father's treasure and guarded by a bear and a serpent. Her only way to ever come out of there was to be saved by a knight descended from her father's bloodline. Not completely impossible, since King Helinus had a son from his first marriage, the one who would inherit the kingdom now that King Helinus himself had been quite literally buried. But the odds of being discovered by a distant cousin were not that high. The punishment Melusine doled out to her second daughter, Melior, wasn't much difference from what Palatine had to go through. Maybe even somewhat better. Melior was forced to live in a castle as a prisoner, which I think is an improvement over the bowers of a mountain, never to be released until a knight managed to successfully watch the sparrowhawk Melior always kept by her side fly for 3 days without rest. Maybe she had a better living situation than her little sister, but I guess her odds of getting out of there were just as slim. But it was Melusine who, as the eldest daughter and the ringleader for this entire plan, had to bear the brunt of her mother's anger and punishment. Looking at her daughter dead in the eye, Melusine reminded her that, as the eldest, she should have known better, and that the fact that her father had broken his oath was no excuse for what Melusine had done to him. Since, as the eldest, she bore the most guilt, also her punishment needed to be bigger than her sister's. Breaking with the pattern, Melusine did not imprison Melusine anywhere, but she cursed her to transform into a serpent from the waist down every Saturday from midnight to midnight. A normal, human-looking girl 6 days a week and half a monster for half the weekend. Let me just remind you here that the serpent for medieval society and for Christian society at large is the symbol of the devil. So for 1 day a week, Melusine was off demonic. Melusine did not stop her daughter from wandering around or making friends. She also told her she could know the joys of love as long as she could conceal her periodic deformity by finding a lover who would agree not to visit her on the day of her punishment. If such a lover could abide to the oath for their lives, Melusine would die immortal and be rid of her curse, which was way better than the fate awaiting her sisters. But if the lover agreed to the condition and then broke the oath, Melusine would spend all eternity as a winged snake, in perpetual flight and in perpetual pain. Considering that her own father had been exactly that type of oath breaker, I don't think Melusine had that much faith in males or humanity in general. Still, even with the curse transforming her in a serpent or half a serpent every Saturday, Melusine had sort of obtained what she wanted from the start. She had left Avalon and could now wander around. There is no time frame for how long she wandered around, descending from the British Isles into the European mainland, but at some point she settled into the forest of Colombier in Poitou, in France, next to a fountain in the woods, which was known as the Fountain of Thirst. In connecting Melusine to a water source, the race was indicating the connection between her and the supernatural world. As Melusine was enjoying her freedom, seeking privacy from the other creatures of the forest every Saturday, a tragedy was unfolding in the same woods. During a hunt, a normal pastime in the Middle Ages for the nobles, Raymondin, Count of Poitou, ended up accidentally killing his uncle rather than the boar he was aiming at. Quite rightly devastated by the tragedy, the young count wandered the forest in a daze, arriving at the Fountain of Thirst. There he saw the most beautiful maiden he had ever seen. Yeah, you guessed, Melusine. Over the course of some days, she helped him get over the tragedy, and he grew so much in love with her that he asked her to marry him and come live with him in his castle. Much like her mother, although Melusine and Raymondin did actually court for some time before jumping into marriage like Elinus and Priscine, Melusine accepted on the condition that Raymondin never sought her out on a Saturday. If Raymondin thought this was a weird request, he didn't voice his doubts and accepted the condition. As her dowry, Melusine gave a new husband the fiefdom Lusignan, where, the legend says, in just a few nights she built for him a fortress worthy of his status. She is known as the Builder Fairy, because she is said to have built the town of Lusignan and some other fortresses and ramparts in the territory. All these structures survived until today and were appropriated during the centuries by other noble families who wanted a connection to Melusine. What followed was a decade of prosperity for Raymondin and his lands. Like all fairy folk, Melusine had brought riches and power to the husband's line. She gave him not just cities and fortresses, but also the most important riches in the Middle Ages for a noble family. She gave Raymondin 10 sons. In a time when, unfortunately, girls were considered a waste of money for the dowry that needed to be prepared for them, a woman capable of birthing only boys, even though women have no chance of actually being able to regulate the gender of the baby, was a treasure in itself. Too much good fortune, though, would not make the story interesting. So, to counterbalance the luck of having birthed only sons, each of those boys was afflicted by some kind of physical malformity, except the last two, which had nothing of note. As I said, in the Middle Ages, physical malformities were considered either a sign of the devil or a sign of something supernatural in your family tree. In this case, the deformities were quite difficult to overlook. The firstborn had eyes of red and blue, which granted is not a great disfigurement. His brothers would have worse, but it was clearly a sign of otherworldly blood. The second had a face as red as fire. The third, one eye lower than the other. The fourth was hideously scarred on his face, and the fifth had only one eye. Some says in the middle of his forehead. The sixth, Geoffrey, was the most famous, or infamous, depending on your opinion of him, of the sons of Melusine. He became known as Geoffrey Big Tooth, and I think you can imagine what kind of malformity he was born with. Quite famous was also his younger brother, Raymondin, born with a brush of hair bristling from his nose. He was followed by another brother with 3 eyes, who, in some versions of the story, was given the name Horrible. I don't know if this was due to his nature, or if, having named 7 sons, they had run out of fantasy. The last 2 sons, as I said, were normal, pretty boys. The presence of 2 perfectly human sons was not enough to save Melusine from suspicion. People started talking, first in the castle, then in the fiefdom, suggesting that their lady was spending her Saturdays with the devil, hence the cursed brood. Raymondin's brother, probably jealous of him and his beautiful wife, presented such a persuasive case that Raymondin decided it was about time for him to see exactly what his wife was up to on a Saturday, his promise to her completely forgotten. Once a Saturday came around, he stood behind the door of Melusine's chamber without making a sound and spied on his wife from a hole in the wood. Imagine his surprise and dismay when he saw her transforming in a monster with the lower half of a serpent. He recoiled in disgust, but the love he bore for Melusine was greater than anything else, so he banished his brother and kept his wife's secret. Even she was not aware that the promise had been broken. Things continued peacefully until one day Geoffrey Big Tooth crowned a career as a murderous and pillaging brigand by setting an abbey on fire. Little did he know beforehand that it was in that abbey that his little brother Raymondin had decided to retreat from the world. He died, tortured with another 100 monks. When the news reached Raymondin and Melusine, they were understandably shocked. One of their sons had one of his brothers murdered. He had killed 100 of innocent people and had gone against God by burning down a sacred abbey. This was the final straw for Raymondin. Not even his love could survive in front of such news. He rounded Melusine, in his mind now the spawn of the devil who had corrupted his children, and told her, "Go, foul snake, contaminator of my children." Horrified, Melusine discovered she had been betrayed, and knew that her mother's curse would take hold. She told Raymondin, forgiving him for having cast her out. She also used her powers of divination to tell him to forgive Geoffrey, for he would repent and become a great man, and as a last favour to her, to kill the son Horrible, the one born with 3 eyes, because if left alive, he would create havoc in the world. Then she set 1 foot on the stone still of their castle in Lusignan. A legend says that the footprint stayed there for centuries and leaped in the air, transforming into a flying serpent. She circled the castle 3 times, crying all the way, and then vanished from sight. Raymondin would never recover again. He stopped talking and finished his days as a hermit in monastic contemplation. Melusine would return to the castle in secret every night to nurse her two youngest children until they didn't need her anymore. At that point, she vanished, only to return as a great winged snake on the Friday before each Lord of Lusignan was to die, to announce his death by wailing from the battlements. She also announced with mournful cries when the land of Poitou would come back to her lineage if it had been lost. So ends the story of Melusine. In later version, she begs her mother to give her another human body, only for Melusine to give her a male body, which contrasted with her female soul, causing indescribable pain in Melusine. For centuries, it was said that Melusine carried out her duties faithfully, so much so that in France, people started to refer to the sound of the wind in the chimneys as Melusine's cries. Since this was a commissioned work, is there anything true in it? Well, yes and no. There is a Geoffrey of Lusignan, head of the family in the middle of the 12th century, which for centuries has been taken as Geoffrey Big Tooth of the story. Unfortunately, or fortunately for him, he neither had a disproportionate tooth nor a penchant for murdering innocents. There was also an abbey that burned down following some bandit attack, but the numbers of monks dead didn't surpass 10, which is still a lot, but far less than the hundreds of the tale. What had Jean-Duc de Berry hoped to achieve with such work? For one, it gave him and his family a good ancestry and an explanation for Charles VI's insanity. For two, he could say he had heard Melusine's cry on the day he conquered Poitou, meaning she had given him her blessing as the land had returned to her family. That apparently gave him everything he needed to be recognized as Lord of those lands. The story had such an international resonance that royal families all over Europe raced to prove they were some way connected to the fairy Melusine. She became the ancestress of the Luxembourg royal family, of the Plantagenets, and even of the Tudors. Jean-Duc de Berry had wanted an ancestress for his own family, but he accidentally created a mother for half the royal of Europe. But what about today? Did Melusine rule ended with the vanishing of most royal houses, or is she still part of our lives? As you might have imagined, she is still here, although in quite a different capacity. To talk about that, I need to introduce briefly a type of book typical of the Middle Ages, a bestiary. It is, as the name implies, a book of beasts. Any beast, whether real or imaginary, would be catalogued in such a book, with a name, an image, a description, and, depending on the beast, a virtue or a sin attached to it. Some of the beasts, which were considered quite legendary in the Middle Ages, ended up being rather normal for us. For example, the elephant or the leopard. But others have kept their status of legends. One of those beasts is the siren. At this point, it's better if I make a clarification. In most, if not all, Romance languages, there is only one word for both a siren and a mermaid. In Saxon languages, such as German and English, the two terms mean something completely different. A siren is a beast with the face and the torso of a woman, and the body and the wings of a bird. They have beautiful voices, but they're not beautiful creatures in themselves. They lure men with their singing, not with their beauty. They are the monsters Ulysses encounters in the Odyssey. They are of ancient Greek origin, with connections to Egypt and the Middle East. A mermaid, on the other hand, is half woman, half fish. She is known for both her voice and her beauty. They are spirits of water, and they can be good and bad, whereas the sirens can only be bad. The first recognizable mermaid comes from Mesopotamia. She was the goddess Atagartis, the Assyrian goddess of fertility, moon, and water, who fell in love with a mortal. Depending on the version, she either tried to drown herself because she had accidentally killed her human lover, or because she had been violated by such human lover and wanted to hide her shame. In any case, she didn't drown, and half her body became that of a fish. Those two completely separate traditions came together in Europe in the Middle Ages when the European scholars started to find the ancient Greek texts talking about sirens. Since they had the text, but not the illustrations, they had some difficulty imagining the characters, and so they superimposed the mermaid's imagery with the siren's characteristics. This is why in the Romance languages there is only one word for both of them, and in the Saxon languages both words picture the same monster. In the Middle Ages, mermaids were seen as the symbol of duality, the unity of earth and water. They were considered alchemical monsters. In the Christian tradition, mermaids symbolized a warning against the sin of the flesh. Both these interpretations gave rise to a new type of siren in the bestiaries, the so-called two-tailed mermaid. By superimposing together the alchemical tradition of duality, the Christian tradition of sin of the flesh, and the old pagan tradition, which saw mermaids representing the goddess mother, thereby becoming a symbol of fertility, the bestiaries invented a new monster, a mermaid with not one but two tails open wide, as if to imitate the fertility totems of the pagan religions. At the end of the 19th century, in Germany, there was another mistaken superimposition. Until that point, it had been very clear in every variation of the story that Melusine had the lower half of a serpent, not a fish. She had never been considered a mermaid. But then, somehow, the two imageries got mixed together. The serpent half became a fishtail, and Melusine became a mermaid, with either one or two tails. The reason I'm telling you all of this is that there's still a Melusine, this time with a small m in our everyday life. Whether you like and drink coffee or not, I think you're all familiar with the logo of Starbucks. On the white cup, there's the face of a woman in green, with a crown with a star on her head and a tail on either side. Yes, the logo of Starbucks is a twin-tailed mermaid, a Melusine. She is not the Melusine of the story. That one still has a serpent body, but since the mistake in the 19th century, which led people to call sirens Melusine, she's now considered exactly that. In a way, Melusine, daughter of Pressine and Linus, Lady of Lusignan, is still alive today, watching over us as if we were her own descendants. Legendary or not, this heroine has created a path that not only shaped the continent, uniting it through common ancestry, but also shaped a way of life for us in today's world. We are once again at the end of another historical path. As always, I thank you for your attention, my fellow travelers, and I hope you've enjoyed our stroll into the ancestry of Europe's royal blood. I think also that from now on, you'll look at your cup of coffee in quite a different way. I know I did. And if the lure of it becomes too much, then you know it is the siren song you need to blame. If you want to know more about how history shaped our modern world, or if you want to step into some hidden bonus path, join me at www.theappleandthehero.com. I will wait for you here in 2 weeks, when we'll go to the east of Europe, where the prince of a small state with a rather despicable hobby became one of the most famous creatures of the night. As always, all the research and the writing of this episode has been done by me, Sara Orfali, Doctor in History. If you've liked it, please hit the subscribe button. Goodbye for now. Safe travels.